We heard this morning about the Baltic states. The real egregious case of maltreatment of Russian speakers is in only one of them, Latvia, where the proportion of Russian-speaking minority is the greatest, 2 or 3 times greater than in the other two, and where the state's monitoring, harassment, persecution of the Russian community's leaders has been on a level unparalleled in Estonia and Lithuania. Each of these countries has its own museum dedicated to the time of what they call the Soviet occupation. But in Estonia, for example, something resembling common sense appears in the historical narrative set out in the Municipal Museum of Tallinn, which says directly, as you enter, that prior to 1990, Estonians had a nation of their own during only 20 years in their past 1,000 years, the interwar years following World War I. That is a useful reminder to the whole region and sweeps aside entirely the anti-Russian disposition of nationalists. I have written about Latvia. An article I published in 2018 was entitled Republic of Latvia, Apartheid State Within the EU. My use of the term apartheid was not arbitrary. I had something specific in mind coming from my own visit to Johannesburg and Cape Town in the last year of President Botha and his apartheid regime. Namely, that when such a regime loses its confidence in its own ideology, as was clearly the case in South Africa that I visited, judging by its theater, judging by the de facto acceptance of the black middle classes in what were formerly white townships, then its days are numbered. Such a loss of self-confidence among the enforcers of highly discriminatory ethnic policies I saw on my visit to Riga in March 2014, when I spent several days as the guest of the city authorities, who were generously welcoming visitors to experience Riga, cultural capital of Europe. The organizer of this event, a close deputy of the city's mayor, confided to me at a cocktail that the law depriving more than 300,000 of her fellow Latvians of their citizenship, Russian speakers who arrived after 1939, was a tragic mistake. Bear in mind that she had been one of the enforcers of this discriminatory policy. Regrettably, the end of regime symptoms that I detected 5 years ago during the Riga European Cultural Capital events has not progressed. On the contrary, repression has only increased since then with the implementation of draconian laws to remove entirely Russian from the educational system. Given this case, and considering what we heard a bit earlier this afternoon about naturalization, I'm left wondering why the Russian Federation does not grant special privileges in naturalization and resettlement to Russian speakers in Latvia, as it has done for the Donbass population. That could lance this festering wound. Does the treatment of Russian minority influence the conduct of these countries within European Union politics, within foreign policy formulation? I don't think so. The most forceful promoter of containment against Russia within the EU has been Lithuania under the presidency of Dalia Grybauskaite. While in terms of its Russian-speaking minority, Lithuania is less problematic than the other two states. Turning to the issue of how Russian speakers are treated in the rest of the Union, I do not have research at hand either for the Union as a whole or for selected countries. But I do have some comments to offer here, based on what may be called anecdotal evidence, which I'm sure many of you in the audience will validate from your own experience and the experience of people you know. What I'm about to say is based primarily on what I've seen and heard here in Belgium over the course of the last 25 years, with some supporting evidence from the United Kingdom, from Greece, and elsewhere where I've traveled extensively. As an overarching generalization, I offer the following. In the 1990s, right up to about 2007, the Russian Federation was viewed favorably by governments of old Europe, while Russians as individuals were viewed negatively or with skepticism by that same officialdom. From 2007, and from the time of Vladimir Putin's famous speech in Munich, up to today, I see a progression in the inverse relationship. Russians as individuals are viewed with respect, while the Russian Federation ceased in 2012 to be considered a strategic partner of the EU and began its slide into the present category of adversary. Perhaps this is validation of the old truth in politics that it is better to be feared than to be liked. What exactly am I talking about? Let's go back to the period 1995 to 2000 here in Brussels, when the mayor was a certain François-Xavier de Donaire, coming from the political party of the Liberals, the Mouvement Réformateur, the same party that gave us in the last Belgian government Foreign Minister Reinders and Prime Minister Charles Michel, today's President of the European Council. And I'm bringing up now what I heard in this public forum where Donaire held forth, and he answered a question about possible liberalization of visa requirements for Russians. This is in about 1998. Donaire said without a moment's hesitation that he opposed it because there were too many crooks among the Russians. Of course, that was a time when Belgian political gossip was rife with stories of Russians who arrived here with suitcases stuffed with cash, who bought villas out in Waterloo and elsewhere. But exactly that view of Russia as a mafia state was raised by none other than Angela Merkel in the period around 2012, when the introduction of visa-free regime for Russia in successive stages was still a major issue in the long, drawn-out negotiations to renew the country's strategic partnership agreement. Going back to the 1990s and continuing well into the new millennium, Russian women traveling alone and entering the Schengen zone, or for that matter, entering the UK, could expect close scrutiny from passport control, if not downright refusal of entry on grounds that they were likely prostitutes. That derogatory, insulting practice was applied without regard to age, right up to female arrivals in their 70s. I would like to believe that such behavior no longer applies, although my wife has told me about very rough treatment that was given to some women friends of the Russian choreographer Vyacheslav Samadurov from the Opera and Ballet Theater in Ekaterinburg, when they arrived in Zaventem in 2014 as his guests to see the premiere of his ballet Romeo and Juliet in Antwerp. Perhaps you have cases of your own. While official Belgium stands by NATO policy and how it frames the relationship with the Russian Federation, society here is sharply divided on how to view Russia and Russians. I've written about how French-speaking Belgian aristocracy and private business bought up all 175 seats in the first ever Russian Christmas New Year's gala dinner organized in the Cercle Royal Gaulois in January 2018 and in the second such gala in January of this year. The club's president called out the tricentenary of Peter the Great's visit to Spa as a demonstration of the very long and close association between Russia and the peoples and the land we now know as Belgium. Russian art and high culture were the topic of discussion at cocktails at the dinner table. There was great enthusiasm and cries of "Paix d'Odna" when the Cossack orchestra members carried glasses of vodka to the leading personalities from the Russian emigration at their tables. This, I submit, is the status quo in Belgium and likely in other old Europe, member states of the Union. Government officials still are in the thrall of NATO policy. High society is much more free-thinking in its estimation of Russia and Russians, and I would add, the man on the street is also similarly questioning what the media and what the official foreign policy is. I come back from a visit to Petersburg. I go down to the greengrocer on the corner of my street. I say where I've come from, and he says, Putin. Regrettably, the inverse relationships that I've described do not apply across the ocean. In the United States, the wave of Russophobia that we see today applies both to the Russian Federation. Yes, I'm just finishing. Which is now identified as the greatest threat to U.S. security, and also in the insidious characterizations of Russians as individuals. I think in particular of statements by the former National Intelligence Director James Clapper during an NBC interview on the 28th of May, 2017, when, with reference to the alleged Russian meddling in U.S. political processes, he recalled, quote, the historical practices of the Russians who typically are almost genetically driven to co-opt, penetrate, gain favor, whatever, which is a typical Russian technique, end quote. Later he added, quote, it's in their DNA. If such words were used to describe blacks or Hispanics, the author would be universally condemned for racism. But in today's America, such bigotry with reference to Russians is all too commonplace.